Good day. Today is Monday, 4th August 2025, and the situation with the diplomacy between the United States and Russia continues to be completely chaotic, at least as far as I can see. We have one announcement made over the weekend, which is then immediately contradicted the day after. And what I'm thinking of specifically in this case is the trip of Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, to Moscow. Now, Trump spoke last week about the fact that Witkoff was heading to Moscow. Then over the weekend, there were reports, including numerous reports in the Russian media, that he would be arriving in Moscow over the weekend. Then yesterday, Sunday, there were reports that he was coming and was expected on that particular day. And then this morning, we have President Trump saying that he's not likely to come to Moscow before Wednesday or Thursday at the earliest. Now, the Russian news agency TASS, which is, of course, Russia's official news agency, is now saying that he's expected to arrive in Moscow on Wednesday. And Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, is saying that it is not excluded that whilst he is in Moscow, he will meet Putin, which is an elegant way of confirming that he is indeed going to be meeting with Putin over the course of his visit. It is completely unclear what the purpose of Witkoff's trip to Moscow actually is. It seems, so far as I can see, that he's coming with no new ideas. He's not going to come with any new set of proposals. There's been suggestions that he's coming with an ultimatum in his pocket from Trump. Supposedly, the timing of the visit is now being rescheduled in order to take place immediately prior to the expiry of Trump's 8th August deadline. The idea is that Witkoff will go there, tell Putin that he must agree to an immediate ceasefire there and then, following which, in the event following which the sanctions threat will be withdrawn, but failing which the sanctions and the secondary tariffs on Russia's trading partners will be imposed. I cannot imagine that anybody in the administration, including the president himself, seriously believe that Putin is going to agree to any ultimatums presented to him by Witgoff. As has been said on numerous occasions, Putin doesn't take well to ultimatums. When he is presented with them, he invariably rejects them. And I can't imagine that on this occasion anybody in the Trump White House has any doubts now that that would be his response if an ultimatum of that kind were indeed presented to him. My own view is different. I continue to believe that what Trump is probably trying to do is to get through Witkoff some promise from Putin that Putin is indeed considering in some way some kind of negotiated process to end the conflict in Ukraine. There are, after all, already negotiations underway between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul. There have been 3 meetings now, and supposedly preparations are underway for a 4th meeting. Anyway, Trump is looking for some kind of token concession from Putin with respect to the negotiations, enabling Trump either to call off his sanctions and secondary tariff threats entirely, or more likely so that he can water them down in some way. But that is purely a guess. Trying to make any sense of this is extremely difficult. Nor has there been so far any explanation of why Witgoff's visit has been delayed in the way that it clearly has been. Why was it the case that Witgoff, who was expected in Moscow over the weekend, is now apparently expected to be there on Wednesday, given the deadlines that Trump has himself imposed? Well, Witgoff is, as I've discussed in many programs and as others have also said, a seriously overworked man. He is simultaneously trying to negotiate ceasefires in the conflict in Gaza, and he's trying to get the negotiations with the Iranians over their uranium enrichment program back on track. Two impossible outcomes, many would say. Anyway, he's tied up with all of that. Maybe he's just got too much to do with respect to those two other matters to make it possible for him to come to Moscow over the weekend. And that's why his trip has been delayed until Wednesday. I would have thought, especially given how intractable the two other conflicts are, and given that the president has himself imposed this deadline of the 8th of August, that Trump would prioritize Witkoff's visit to Moscow and would tell Witkoff, well, the other two matters can wait. I appreciate many people would find that a horrifying thought, given that every single day more and more people in Gaza grow hungry and starve. But we are talking about Donald Trump here and the administration. I would have thought that Trump's specific priority, would be to get some kind of dialogue going with the Russians, and that would take precedence over other things. Of course, it's possible that it's the Russians who asked for the visit to be delayed. Putin is an exceptionally busy man. It's also likely that he will want to consult widely before Witgoff arrives. I believe that there is a meeting of the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, the one which Putin chairs and which Dmitry Medvedev vice chairs, just saying. I believe that there's a regular meeting scheduled on Tuesday. Maybe Putin wants to discuss with the Russian officials, the important Russian officials who sit on the Security Council, what, or perhaps more precisely how, Russia's response should be couched when Witgoff finally appears and when Putin meets with him. Anyway, I'm not going to explore this further. Suffice to say, Witgoff is heading to Moscow, and the Russians are saying that he'll be there on Wednesday. Well, in the meantime, the Russian media has been writing about this trip, and there's been a discussion about it in Izvestia, the Russian newspaper. Once upon a time, in Soviet times, Izvestia, alongside Pravda, was the most important newspaper of the Soviet Union. It was the official organ of the Soviet government, or to be more precise, actually, of the Soviet parliament. But everybody knew that it was run by the Soviet government. And in the Khrushchev era, it was actually seen by some people as even more important than Pravda itself, because the editor of Izvestia was none other than Khrushchev's son-in-law. Anyway, whatever. It is still an important newspaper in Russia today, even though it is not directly connected to the Russian government as it once used to be. Anyway, Izvestia has published an article about Witkoff's visit. I'll read a summary. The summary is entitled "Moscow Unfazed by US Pressure Tactics as it Prepares for dialogue with Trump's envoy. And then we're told that the contacts with Steve Witkoff will reveal the true position of the United States, in contrast to the loud statements coming from the White House. And we're told that this was told to Izvestia by Grigory Karazin, chairman of the Federation Council Committee on International Affairs. Now, Grigory Karazin has been one of Russia's negotiators over the last couple of months. He was the negotiator that Putin picked to conduct the dialogue with the Americans about reviving the grain deal in the Black Sea. And Karazin took a very hard line, as one might have expected, over the course of those negotiations. And anyway, suffice to say that there was no revival of the grain deal in the Black Sea. But Karazin is an important official. He's a member of the Federation Council, and he chairs, which is the upper house of the Russian Parliament, and he chairs its Committee on International Affairs. So he's somebody to take seriously. Anyway, Karazin then went on to say President Trump had announced the visit of his special envoy in the run-up to the expiration of the resolution deadline for the Ukrainian conflict and the introduction of new anti-Russian sanctions. Nevertheless, Moscow's stance remains firm, as Russian President Vladimir Putin emphasized during his meeting with his Belarusian counterpart Alexander Lukashenko. Russia's primary objective is to eliminate the root causes of the crisis and ensure its own security, while the conditions laid out as early as June 2024 remain in force. And then we have a direct quote from Karazin. In foreign policy, and particularly in diplomacy, it is always best to be less emotional and more measured. So all the emotions now dominating the media space with all these statements and references to big names, Trump should be taken calmly. There will be contacts with Witkoff that will reveal what the United States actually thinks, not for the public eye, about the absolutely destructive role currently played by the European Union countries, which tightly control the Zelensky regime. All of that will be discussed. I believe that following these contacts, we will at least know everything of substance. Therefore, we must remain patient, composed, and resist emotional responses. And there's then a further series of comments by Ivan Loshkarev, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Theory at Moscow State Institute of International Relations and World Economy under the Russian Foreign Ministry. That, by the way, is one of the most prestigious institutions in Russia dealing with international relations. And Loshkarev says to Izvestia, there are threats of expanding sanctions, ramping up NATO's military activity along Russia's borders, and establishing new mechanisms to support Ukraine. Some of this may be implemented if the media campaign fails to yield results. To intensify the pressure, there could also be accusations directed at Russia, including claims of cyber attacks. Without a doubt, it is necessary to conduct dialogue with Witgoff and with other US representatives. A return to a constructive tone is possible. But for now, the ball is in America's court. We are by no means refusing a respectful dialogue. And the last words, by the way, were said not by Loshkarev, but by Oleg Karpovich, Vice Rector of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. That's the man who trains Russia's diplomats. And then lastly, we have a further comment from an actual senior Russian Foreign Ministry official, Mikhail Galuzin, Deputy Foreign Minister, who's already taken part in talks, and he says he's told Izvestia Moscow does not intend to escalate the conflict, and Russia is counting on a fourth round of negotiations with Ukraine. As for Ukraine's position on continuing direct contacts and the substance of those talks, that will depend on the rhetoric adopted by its Western allies. So there we go. We have four very, very senior, well-connected Russians. Karazin, who is a member of the Federation Council, the upper house of Russia's parliament, its chair of its Committee on Foreign Relations, and a former Russian diplomat, and a current senior negotiator with the Americans. A more senior official, incidentally, than Vladimir Medinsky, the man who is meeting with the Ukrainians at the moment, who is Russia's chief negotiator with the contacts with the Americans. Then we have two very senior, very well-connected academics, experts, whose job it is to train Russian diplomats and to develop Russian foreign policy. MGIMO also works as a kind of think tank. And then we also have Galuzin, who is currently the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia. And all of them are saying the same thing. Russia is not going to make any concessions. Russia is not bothered or alarmed by the latest statements pouring out of Washington or out of the White House. They will listen to whatever it is that Witgoff is saying. They're not going to refuse dialogue with Witgoff because Russia does not believe, as a matter of principle, that dialogue should be refused. But that doesn't mean that we should expect any concessions from them. So that's the Russian stance. It's been outlined thoroughly by Zvestia. There's no reason to expect that it's going to change. And as Karasin pointed out, it's already been set out clearly by Vladimir Putin. Well, it seems to me that if the Russian position is clear, in the United States, it's becoming increasingly clear that Donald Trump, as president, is losing control of the process. The Senate Appropriations Committee, we're now told by the Washington Post, which is dominated, has obviously a Republican majority, but one which is deeply aligned with Mitch McConnell, is apparently now proposing to add a $55 billion appropriation, attach a $55 billion appropriation to the US defense budget, which is funding for future arms deliveries to Ukraine. Now that goes completely contrary to Donald Trump's insistence that henceforth all arms deliveries to Ukraine from the United States should be paid for by the US's European allies and laundered to Ukraine via NATO. The Senate Appropriations Committee takes a different view. They believe that the old Biden practice of direct funding for arms deliveries to Ukraine by the United States itself, the payment of grants, the providing, in other words, of grants to Ukraine, that should continue exactly as it did during the Biden era. And the Washington Post says that the hardliners in the Republican Party, in the Senate in particular, now feel that the momentum has passed to them, that Trump in effect has blinked, and that this is the moment for them to take advantage, to ram through further funding for military supplies by the United States to Ukraine, in effect ignoring everything that Donald Trump himself has said and everything which Donald Trump has agreed with the Europeans. Now, there is apparently a majority for this in the Senate. Of course, it doesn't mean that it will survive in the House, but then it might do, because there are lots of Republican neoconservatives in the House as well, and they're likely to line up with the Democrats there. And for the record, since we're talking about the US defense budget, I don't believe that Speaker Johnson is in a position to stop this particular amendment being put to the floor of the House, as he's tried to stop other appropriations bills provided by Congress going to the floor of the House before. And if the Senate and the House, if Congress votes for this appropriation, then of course it will be presented to Trump in a bill. And at the moment, given the direction of events, it looks to me as if Trump is likely to sign it into law. In other words, contradicting his own policies, his own stated policies, which is that the United States henceforth only sells weapons to Ukraine, it no longer transfers them. Now, I know that many of you who are watching these programs are of the view that this has been Trump's purpose and objective all along, that he was stringing his Republican base, his MAGA base, I should say, all along when he said that there would be no funding in future for arms deliveries to Ukraine, that he and the neocons have always been in alignment, that he and Lindsey Graham are working hand in hand to do these things, and presumably that Donald Trump is also working with Mitch McConnell, who apparently is the person who has played the decisive role in getting the Republicans in the Senate Appropriations Committee to take this stance. I don't agree, and the reason I don't agree is not only because this is going to cause Trump massive embarrassment and political damage with his MAGA base, but because it is a sign of profound weakness. No president that I can think of ever wants to be outmaneuvered by his opponents in Congress, or even if they're not his opponents in Congress, by people in Congress in this way. Again, one needs to have worked in politics perhaps to understand this, but political leaders always need to show that they are taking the initiative, that decisions that they make are made by them, not imposed by others upon them. This has all of the appearance, whether it is the case or not, of being imposed by Donald Trump, by his opponents in the Senate. And inevitably, that is going to make Trump look weaker, less in control of the political situation in the United States, and that is going to have long-term consequences for him. It will mean that his political adversaries in the Congress, or even people who are not his adversaries, but who want him to do things that he doesn't want to do, they will conclude that this president is weak, that he is not fully in control, that he does not control his own agenda or legislative program, and that if you push hard enough, he will back down and will agree to whatever it is you want. And that will have implications for Donald Trump for the future. But in terms of the conflict in Ukraine and how it plays out, it hardly matters in the end, because one way or the other, it looks as if, despite the catastrophic shortage of weapons that we hear about all the time, appropriations from Congress will continue to be made, and further arms transfers at some level to Ukraine will continue to be made also. As for the Europeans, it remains the case that, as far as I can see, they've stomped up no money at all. They've not bought a single Patriot missile up to this time from the United States for onward trade transfer to Ukraine, or other types of weapons systems either. And of course, all of the European leaders can read the Washington Post, where all this is outlined, and they will be saying to themselves, well, maybe we shouldn't actually be buying weapons from the United States for Ukraine after all, because it looks as if the Senate is going to solve our problem for us, because it's going to ram through this $55 billion appropriation. So why should we stomp up money from our own taxpayers or go into debt doing so? Because after all, the Americans are going to go back and are going to start paying after all. So, for the moment at least, these maneuvers in the Senate probably mean that Ukraine is actually getting fewer weapons than it might otherwise do. If it really were the case that the United States was not going to provide weapons, well, then in that case, perhaps given the urgency of the situation on the Ukrainian battlefield, the Europeans, or some of them at least, might be coming up with some money. But this news has disincentivized them, or so it seems to me, from doing that. Now, if I go back to this proposal that's floating around the Senate, that the Senate Appropriations Committee appears to be embracing, I noticed that it involves straightforwardly taking money out of the frozen Russian assets, something which is legally dubious, to put it mildly, and which there have been repeated warnings about. This at a time when not just Europe's but America's financial position is overstretched, where it seems the Treasury Department is having some trouble getting foreigners to buy US treasuries. Though I should say, as far as I know, most treasuries are actually bought still by US citizens. But anyway, some problems getting foreigners to buy US treasuries. This isn't going to make them want to buy those treasuries more. It's obviously going to make them want to buy those treasuries even less, because of the way in which the United States appears to show little concern for property rights and for the doctrine of sovereign state immunity. Just saying. But anyway, put all that aside, this is all very strange, because as far as I understand it, there are nowhere near enough Russian frozen assets in the United States to make up a $55 billion appropriation. If we're talking about the frozen assets of the Russian central bank, which are believed to be somewhere on the scale of $240 billion, of course, those are held in Euroclear and are controlled by the European Union. Of course, if the United States twists the Europeans' arms and gets the Europeans to part with that money and presumably hand it over to the United States, so that the United States can then use it to buy weapons in the United States for Ukraine, then of course that will mean that the United States gets the money, but the Europeans get all the legal risks, which has a kind of logic to it from an American point of view, though I do wonder whether that will really happen. For the record, I suspect that if this is converted into a bill and the bill is passed, most of the money will come ultimately from US taxpayers, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what Donald Trump has been repeatedly saying. Now, here we have a situation where the Senate has basically forced the president to announce sanctions against Russia, to threaten Russia with further sanctions, to threaten Russia's trading partners with tariffs if they continue to trade with Russia, and where the Senate looks like it's about to twist the president's arm to get him to go back on what he was just saying, 3 weeks ago, to put the president in a position where we're back where we were previously, with the United States supplying weapons to Ukraine and paying for them as well, not the Europeans doing so. Going back to what I was saying about this not making any political sense, at least to me, as something that Donald Trump would want to do, I can't help but think that putting aside the question of Ukraine and any desire by the neocons to keep Project Ukraine alive and to prevent Russia from winning a victory there, I can't help but think that this is also part of the endless political duel, the civil war, which has raged within the Republican Party basically ever since Donald Trump came down the lift in Trump Tower and announced that he would stand for president back in 2015. The constant battle between the Republican establishment, the old Republican establishment, embodied by people like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, and of course the MAGA movement, whose nominal leader is Donald Trump. And the intention, as much as anything else, is to cause, or rather deepen, the already existing split within the MAGA movement, isolating Donald Trump from his supporters, weakening the MAGA movement overall, with the intention of eventually breaking its control of the Republican Party and restoring the old establishment back to overall control. What happens to Ukraine is secondary, and of course any damage done in the meantime to US military preparedness, because more weapons now in exceedingly short supply are going to be shipped off to Ukraine if Lindsey Graham, McConnell and the Republicans all have their say. And if the sanctions and the tariffs are imposed as they want, more economic damage on the United States will also be done. But all of that is secondary to the great battle for control of the Republican Party. For one thing, I suspect that McConnell, Lindsey Graham, all of them probably calculate that if there is a major crisis, if the United States finds itself short of weapons, if the United States finds its economic situation has become critical as a result of the tariffs and the sanctions, well, they're not going to be blamed. Donald Trump is going to be blamed. And Pete Hegseth at the Defense Department is going to be blamed. There's a constant campaign against Pete Hegseth, which you can see all over the media with all sorts of stories being circulated about him. Probably most of them true, by the way, but they wouldn't be appearing in the way they were unless there was a campaign against him. Anyway, All of this, as I said, probably doesn't faze or upset or alarm these people in the Senate, because victory or defeat in Ukraine, questions of military preparedness, the underlying strength or trading position of the US economy are all secondary issues to the primary one of breaking the MAGA movement, regaining control of the Republican Party, consolidating the political establishment, and bringing the situation back basically to where it was before 2015. So that's I suspect, the motivations at play. Of course, it could be, in fact, it almost certainly is, that these people are underestimating the damage that they're doing. They don't realize quite what a catastrophe it would be, not just if Ukraine were defeated, but if it were defeated whilst the United States were aligned with it. Perhaps they don't accept or recognize how potentially catastrophic it would be if the US's military position were undermined to such a great extent that it could not respond to a military crisis. And I do believe that they greatly underestimate the long-term damage to the US economy by the sanctions and tariffs that they insist on imposing. But these are very privileged people, insulated to an extraordinary degree from the harm they do. And to be frank, I think that their political battles in Washington are probably of far greater priority and importance to them than all of these other issues, where I suspect they tell themselves that the United States, being the United States, it will always in the end come through. So anyway, that's my summary of the political diplomatic situation at the moment. The Russians, as that extract that I read from Izvestia show, are completely unmoved by any of this. As far as they're concerned, they're not bothered, because they are now quite clearly winning the war. Now, there's been actually quite a lot of news over the last 24 hours. The Russian Defense Ministry has published statements about the fact that the Russian Air Force has conducted a mass of missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, including missile strikes using Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Russian troops delivered a strike by precision weapons, including Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. This means Geran-2s, hitting Ukrainian military airfields over the past 24 hours in the special military operation. And this is a combined strike, and the goal of the strike, we're told, was achieved. All the designated targets were hit. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense, in fairness, says this in terms of every single combined missile and drone strike that takes place. They always say it's been a success and that all the targets were hit. I've no reason to doubt this. It seems to me in conformity with the information that we get from Ukraine itself, from the pictures we see of the smoke and the damage that's done across Ukraine. But anyway, that is one thing that's happened. The Russians continue to hammer Ukraine every single day. This time, the primary target was military airfields, places where the F-16s and the Mirage 2000s and the Patriot missiles are likely to be based. How much damage was done, who knows? Other days, the Russians attack other facilities, transport nodes, factories that produce military hardware. I've noticed that over the last couple of days, both the Russians and the Ukrainians have been striking at each other's energy targets, thereby confirming that the 30-day energy truce that was declared back in the spring has basically and conclusively expired. The Ukrainians never really honoured it. But anyway, there it is. The Russians continue their missile and drone strikes. But in some respects, it's the situation on the battle lines that is perhaps attracting the greatest amount of attention. And first of all, there's been some reports about the situation in Pokrovsk. The Russian defense, or rather the Russian, not the Russian Defense Ministry, but a defense source, presumably that is the Russian Defense Ministry, has told TASS, the official Russian news agency, that fighters of Russian assault units have actually cut in two the enemy's battle group from the south to the center of Pokrovsk. They have now also reached the city's large neighborhoods, and these are the neighborhoods of Yuzhny, Shakhtorsk, and Lazurny. So, what this report is saying is that the Russians have now penetrated to the center of Pokrovsk, and that they have divided the Ukrainian garrison in two. Now, there have been rumors about this, but this looks like semi-official confirmation provided by somebody at the Defense Ministry to TASS that the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk has been split in some way. I suspect that the reality on the ground in Pokrovsk is much more chaotic. I suspect that there are buildings and locations within Pokrovsk which the Ukrainians control, that there are others which are controlled by the Russians, that nobody's completely certain where the other side is, though obviously the Russians here hold the advantage because it looks as if their communications are much more secure. But anyway, gradually, the situation of the garrison in Pokrovsk is becoming more critical. And earlier this morning, there were reports that, again from Russian sources, but they look like reliable Russian sources, that the Russian military has now broken into the two villages of Rodinska and Belitskaya, north of Pokrovsk, that fighting is now underway in these two villages, or perhaps small towns would be a more accurate way of describing them, with the implication that they're about to be captured by the Russians fairly soon. I already said that the Russians look like they've cut the road, which passes the supply road to Pokrovsk, which passes through these two villages. But of course, if the Russians actually capture these two villages, it will not only consolidate their control, but it will strengthen their bridgehead, the Russian bridgehead, as the Russians continue to advance north of Pokrovsk towards the small town of Dobropilia, and presumably as they also advance southwestwards towards another village called Grishinye, which lies on a small country road, but one which would presumably now be the last remaining road position that the Ukrainians can still use in order to escape from Pokrovsk. Anyway, in the meantime, I ought to say that Google Maps, or at least the Google Maps that I have, are continuing to show the E50 road as temporarily closed, both as it leads into Pokrovsk from the west, and by the way, as it exits Pokrovsk from the east and passes through Mirnograd. It is not yet showing the road that leads to Pokrovsk from the north, the one that passes through Rodinske and Bilitska, as closed, though I can't imagine that it isn't closed also. But anyway, that's where we are. We'll see what happens in Pokrovsk, but the situation there is clearly deteriorating and is continuing to get worse. Now, yesterday, the British Defence Ministry essentially admitted that the situation in Pokrovsk is getting bad. It says that the Russian army are actively engaged in encircling the city of Pokrovsk, the key logistics center of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass. In the last week, the Russian army has been advancing to the northeast of Pokrovsk, trying to bypass and cut off supply routes and ground lines of communication. The Russian army have advanced to the west in the area of the N32 highway, especially in the village of Rodinske, through which the main northern supply route of Pokrovsk passes. In addition, the Russian armed forces have occupied the territory south of the highway, advancing in the area of Mirolyubovka, and the advances continue. But that mostly comes, as I said, that does come, from the British Ministry of Defence. So even the British Ministry of Defence, which has been, well, I don't think anybody who watches these programs will doubt, a major promoter of the Ukrainian army and of its successes, real and imagined, and which has also published some pretty remarkable claims about the Russian army, that it depends on shovels and things of that kind. Anyway, even the British Ministry of Defence appears to recognise that the situation in Pokrovsk is becoming critical. And elsewhere, we've had more news from Chasiv Yar, the town that the Russians say they captured some days ago. There's again been a report about it by the Russian TASS news agency, and it comes from a military expert called Vitaly Kiselyov. Chasiv Yar is a key high point in terms of adjusting observation and conducting combat operations. To all appearances, the Russian army is outflanking the Ukrainians from the south and the north, gradually puncturing enemy forces and edging them out, all the more so as we now hold an advantageous height relative to all other settlements. And Kiselyov said this in a television broadcast on Russian television for Solovyov Live. He went on to say that the Russian army is employing a large number of drones whose operators are successfully interacting with multiple launch rocket system teams, tank crews, and infantry. This indicates that systematic preparations are underway at training grounds, preparations that are ongoing every hour and every day, and this yields very good results and a high effect for the conduct of combat operations and the advance. Elsewhere, there was another report from TASS which said that, contrary to expectations, that the Ukrainians were going to conduct counterattacks in the Chasiv Yar area, they have on the contrary recognized the futility of doing so and have pulled back, that all of the Ukrainian troops who were close to Chasiv Yar have pulled back to Konstantinovka itself, the big town in the area, and are now mostly focused on trying to defend Konstantinovka, which is, of course, in low ground relative to Chasiv Yar. Anyway, there's been lots of other news. I discussed yesterday how the Russians look like they've broken through to Siversk. There continues to be fighting in Kupiansk. There are now clearly alarm on the Ukrainian side about the possibility of a Russian attack on the city of Kherson, of the Russians conducting some kind of amphibious operation in this area. This is where General Templinsky's army group Dnieper is located. It's said to number 150,000 men. It's been pushing northwards along the east bank of the Dnieper towards Zaporozhye city. It captured the village of Kamenska quite recently. It apparently captured another village north of Kamenska called Plavny, and it's currently involved in some kind of battle to capture another important town, fortified town in this area, south of Zaporozhye, called Stepnogorsk. But there's also, it seems now, worries that this force is planning some kind of attack across the Dnieper to capture Kherson city itself. Now, over the last 24 hours, even as these developments play out, I should say that there's been a cascade of news and information which I've received from or have found about the general military picture. First of all, there's been quite a lot of information provided about the overall situation in terms of the drone wars. And you can find all of this information. It's all put together in the Substack blog, Events in Ukraine. And I'll start by saying that apparently recently, about a week ago, a Ukrainian drone specialist called Kirilo Veres gave an interview to the Ukrainian newspaper Ukrainska Pravda. It was also filmed, and you can find the video in Ukrainian on YouTube. But anyway, it had this question and answer session. So the question that was made to Mr. Veres was, how would you assess our enemy in 2025? In what ways are we better or worse than Russia? And then Veres replied, they're ahead of us probably in everything. As unpleasant as it is to say, probably in everything. They've learned how to scale everything faster. This is about drones. And then Ukrainska Pravda responded, yes, they have people and money. And then Veres snapped back, everyone has money. We also have money. Maybe not as much, but we do have it. But they have people. Everything else is secondary. They can afford to do things like that, and we can't. So the main priority in drone warfare is the destruction of personnel. Now, here I'm going to say a number of things. Firstly, I've already spoken in several programs out of my own knowledge about the difference between Russia's drone industry and Ukraine's drone industry. I've discussed how the Russian drone industry works on an industrial system in proper factories, properly managed, with secure supply chains, with proper administrators and managers operating these factories, with trained personnel, and with centralized production targets which can be costed and met. Whereas Ukraine's drone industry, partly because of the unceasing missile and Geran 2 drone strikes, has had to be dispersed and is very fragmented in relatively small workshops. And whilst this can result in high quality drones being produced using increasingly apparently very expensive Ukrainian equipment, and Veres does actually say that some of the drones Ukraine is working with are of very high quality, this cannot make up for the enormous advantages the Russians derive by operating their industry on an industrial scale. Not only is that going to produce many more drones at much lower unit cost, but by definition, it means that innovations in drone technology, like say fiber optic drones, can be dispersed throughout the industry very, very rapidly. Something which it is impossible to do to the same level in small workshops that are dispersed and which do not operate in a centralized way. But there are other things now which are starting to change the balance in the drone war, in the war in the sky. And here perhaps one should mention the change in the drone war done by the appointment of Andrei Belousov, as Russia's new defense minister. Because Belousov, as I discussed previously in many programs, is a highly regarded industrial technocrat, somebody with long experience of industrial management, in some respects different from Shoigu, and somebody with a very keen interest in high technology. And he came into the defense ministry as somebody with a particular interest in drones and in enhancing drone technology. And one of the innovations that he appears to have produced is a setup which is called Rubicon. Now, I've been hearing an awful lot about Rubicon for some time, and like I suspect many people, I assumed that Rubicon was an elite unit of Russian drone operators. Obviously a very effective and highly competent elite unit of Russian drone operators, but basically another unit of that kind, of which there are several, both on the Russian and on the Ukrainian side. It turns out that that is not really what Rubicon is. I mean, there are aspects of it that are like that, but Rubicon functioned in a somewhat different way. It appears to be, yes, a unit, or perhaps a group of units of actual drone operators who operate on the battlefields. It's also a training center for drone operators. It's also a research center for upgrading drones, and one which is connected to the wider Russian industry. But also, and most interesting, it appears to have its own production facilities where it can make and test and try out new types of drones directly on the battlefield. It's been described as a cross between a military unit and a tech company. And I'm gradually getting the sense that it is an expanding facility, that it's doing this on an ever bigger scale and with an effect across the entire combat line, which is having a very, very major impact across the entire throughout the whole conduct of the war. Now, I say this, I've also been receiving information about the state of the two armies and about the drone operators that operate on each side. Now, here I'm going to say something, which is that apparently drone operators on each side post information. We're talking about extremely tech-savvy people by definition. And there's apparently places which they post this information, some of which are to be found on the dark web. Now, I haven't seen this information because I have never accessed the dark web, and I have no intention of ever doing so, even if I were to find ways of doing so, just to make that absolutely clear. So I am obtaining this information at second hand from somebody who has obtained this information and whose business it is to track what drone operators on each side are doing. Anyway, the story that I received from this person is as follows. Russian drone operators are becoming increasingly confident, whereas previously only something like a fifth of drones were able to strike the targets that they were aimed at. Now the strike rate has increased to something like 100%. So if they see a target and they direct a drone at it, it is likely to hit the target. Ukrainian anti-drone defenses along the contact line and in the area immediately behind have, to all intents and purposes, broken down. The Ukrainians no longer have successful abilities to jam Russian drones as they once could. Partly, I suspect, this is because of the increasing use by the Russians of fiber optic drones. By contrast, the Ukrainians are finding it more and more difficult to hit targets with their drones, even as the Russians' ability to strike Ukrainian targets is increasing. The Ukrainians' ability to strike with drones Russian targets is reducing. It is, in fact, now becoming so lopsided that we are close to a point of crisis. And in fact, if we go back to events in Ukraine, we read that now whole areas of roads behind the contact lines are becoming unusable for the Ukrainians, largely because of the intensity of the drones, the coverage by the Russian drones. And the number of these drones is increasing, and the quality is increasing, and the skill of the operators, some of them are very young apparently, is growing all the time. So that's one thing. We are very far from the situation at the beginning of the war, when the Ukrainians had the advantage in drones and were using at that time homemade FPV drones on a scale that the Russians never expected. Today, as I said, it is an organized industry with cutting-edge groups like Rubicon leading it, and for all I know, before long, there'll be other groups like Rubicon as well. So that's drones. But there are other things happening on the battle lines as well. The Russians have apparently developed jammers, which are now making it more difficult for the Ukrainians to attack Russian armored vehicles. Russian tanks are beginning to develop higher levels of immunity to Ukrainian drones, so that the Russians, before long, might be in a position to engage the Ukrainians in mass armored assaults again. The Russians have developed special cloaks, which act as cloaking devices, more difficult for the Ukrainians to see through their drone cameras. This is basically Russian infantry. I'm not going to discuss those. When I say cloaking devices, we're talking about, as far as I can see, camouflage, effective camouflage clothes. And the Russians have far more artillery, far more missiles, far more multiple launch rocket systems. And the Ukrainians, by contrast, because of the ubiquity of the Russian drones, are finding it increasingly difficult to keep their artillery in position close to the contact line. They've had to withdraw some of their artillery behind the Dnieper to the west bank of the Dnieper, because the amount of artillery is short, and if they deploy the artillery too close to the contact line, it risks being picked off rapidly by the Russian drones. By contrast, Russian artillery is now able to operate at will. And anyway, one particular source also told me that the quality of training in the Russian army has now developed to the sort of levels that had not been observable before, and that the Russian army, in terms of its overall competence, is of a much higher level, a much higher standard than it had been in 2022. Whereas by contrast, the Ukrainian army, because of the enormous difficulties in recruitment, its quality, its level, its quality is declining, and declining fast. So that with a situation where the Russian army outnumbers the Ukrainian army, the relative levels being about 650,000 for the Russians, 420,000, 50,000 for the Ukrainians, but the Russians now much better trained, much better equipped, professional contract soldiers, backed by units like Rubicon, backed by aviation, the Russian aircraft with their fab bombs and all of that, and of course with armor supporting them as well. The view now, completely contrary to the one that Donald Trump described, is that the imbalance of losses is now not just tilting heavily towards the Russians, is now no longer just favorable to the Russians, but is becoming extremely lopsided, comparable to what has happened, for example, in some of the Middle East wars, the ones that the United States fought, for example, against the Iraqi army, at least in some locations. And all of this clearly is deepening the sense of crisis. Looking at the situation on the battle lines, already it seems there are major gaps. The Ukrainians are no longer able to defend stretches of territory. One of the iron laws, apparently, of defense is that you have to have a continuous defense line. The idea of creating sort of fortified locations and abandoning the countryside, all that leads to is that it all but guarantees that your fortified positions are going to become surrounded and that your entire defense position is going to crash. So you need to maintain continuous defense lines. That, for the Ukrainians, is no longer possible. And it means that the entire Ukrainian defense system is starting to break down, as if water was seeping through cracks in a dam, gradually causing the entire dam to burst. Now, Michael Kaufman, who is one of the most astute and intelligent commentators about military matters that I know of, I mostly disagree with him, by the way, about the Ukraine war. He has taken a very, very strong pro-Ukrainian position about the war, and he's tended to be deeply critical of the conduct of the Russian military over the course of this war. I've heard stories that he has a Ukrainian background. I don't know whether that is true or not, I should say. But anyway, despite all of that, Michael Kaufman is someone I personally take very seriously. He's now talked about this huge defense line that the Ukrainians are trying to build west of the fortified cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Pokrovsk. And he says that putting aside the weaknesses, the inherent weaknesses of this defense line, the fact that it's been cut into the open steppe, that it's perhaps not being planned as well as it might be. I've been reading lots of reports from the Ukrainian side of the internet about how the fact that many of the people who are building or are being tasked to build this fortified line are civilian contractors with little understanding of what fortifications, actual fortifications, mean. This is in contrast to the Surovikin line, which was planned by Russian military engineers, specifically by General Romanchuk, who is the Russian General Staff's expert on building defense lines. And even though civilian contractors participated in the building up of the Surovikin line, they did so under the close supervision of military engineers. Anyway, apparently that isn't true to anything like the same extent with the defense line that the Ukrainians are building. Anyway, Kaufman says that even if it is built, there just aren't going to be enough Ukrainian troops to man it properly. There will inevitably be gaps. There will be large areas which are left unoccupied by Ukrainian troops, and this will create gaps through which the Russian army will be able to move, with the Russians able to break through these defences without very much difficulty. Now, on top of all of these problems, I also read recently an article, I think it was in the Left of Centre magazine, British magazine Unheard, which spoke about the success that the Russians have now achieved in building up a very, very complex and effective intelligence gathering network in Ukraine. There are apparently large numbers of informers. They're able to pass on information to the Russian military about Ukrainian military positions, about where the Ukrainians are. The whole of Ukraine now seems to be riddled with informers. Many of them, by the way, apparently very young people again. Something which I have deep personal misgivings about. I'm not happy about the fact that young people are being led into this sort of thing. But of course it's war, and war is a ruthless endeavour, and ruthless things like this get done. Anyway, a lot of this is going on, and again, I suspect that the Russians now are indeed very, very, very well informed about pretty much everything that they need to know about Ukraine's military effort. The summary of what I'm saying is that whatever the Senate does or decides to do, whatever assistance it now decides to provide Ukraine, it's too late. The Ukrainian army is wasting away. There's been some talk about the Ukrainians conducting some kind of counterattack in some place. It's been pointed out that August tends to be the traditional month for Ukrainian counterattacks. That's what they did during in 2022 when they launched the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives, and what they also did during the time of the big Zaporozhye offensive in 2023 and the Kursk offensive in 2024. They all tend to be clustered around the summer, and they generally fall either in August or close to August. But this time I do generally wonder whether the Ukrainian military is in any position to conduct offensives any longer on that kind of scale. Especially as I saw yet another report which said that the two elite brigades, the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 3rd Azov Brigade, have now increasingly taken to rejecting instructions, orders to plug gaps in defense lines where they think that doing so would be, in effect, an act of suicide. So, anyway, there it is. That's the situation on the battlefronts today. A Ukrainian army that is wasting away. I can't see, based on all of this information that I've received, how this situation is going to change. I don't know what message Steve Witgoff is taking with him to Moscow. I don't know what the Senate is trying to do. But we are now far past the point of no return, and the Russians have already made clear that they're not interested in making concessions. Meanwhile, there seems to be growing anger in the United States, at least on the part of some people, that the various warnings and threats against third countries that trade with Russia are not being heeded. A White House aide, Stephen Miller, has been talking to Reuters, and he seems particularly angry with India. He is accusing India of sustaining the Russian war effort by buying Russian oil. And he's speaking about India in extremely hostile terms and very angry and frustrated terms because the Indians have not capitulated. I suspect that they were expected to, that the Americans assumed that they would, and are deeply frustrated that India seems to be standing by not just Russia, but by the BRICS group as a whole, which seems collectively unfazed by all the various threats of secondary tariffs and sanctions that the United States is now making. Well, I have to say, I am unsurprised. I would say that trade between Russia and India has not has not been without its problems. The Indians pay for Russian oil with rupees. The Indian currency, the rupee, is very, very controlled. The Russians have struggled to spend the rupees that they receive from the Indians on products that they want. They can't convert the rupees into other currencies. Perhaps in time they will find, or they will invest in the Indian economy in ways that will make the oil trade between India and Russia more profitable for Russia. But I noticed that the Russians, as part of the OPEC Plus arrangement, have just entered into an agreement with the Saudis, with the Gulf states, with the other OPEC producers to increase oil production, to raise the quotas on oil production. And to me, that signals the fact that the Saudis, at least, don't expect importers of Russian oil to stop buying it. Otherwise, why would they agree through OPEC Plus a agreement with the Russians to increase production, one in which both the Russians and the Gulf producers increase production as well? Now, you would have thought that Donald Trump would welcome this move by the Saudis and the Russians. But of course, given the stance he's been taking about tariffs against countries that import Russian oil, presumably he can't do that. None of this, to me, makes any kind of sense. It's part of the series of extraordinary mistakes and missteps that Donald Trump has himself taken. And as I said, I can't imagine that any of this is going to do him any good. But anyway, this is where I finish today's program. No doubt we'll be hearing more tomorrow. As I said, the situation in Pokrovsk looks like it's developing steadily and fast. If the British Ministry of Defence is talking about Pokrovsk being circled, then things clearly are very bad there. We will see what happens in the Senate, what the Senate Appropriations Committee decides to do, what Donald Trump himself decides to say about it. And of course, we'll have to wait for Steve Witgoff and see what he brings with him to Moscow. But I remain of my view, as of today's program, that all of these diplomatic moves are now too late. The situation on the battlefronts is now clearly past the point of no return. I don't know what all of these people think they're doing, but if I was them, I would save their time and energy for more important, for other more useful things. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.